Hi everyone, this is Julia from The Art of Creating and welcome to my painting video. In this video, I'm going to show you how to paint this cat and the moon in watercolor using the wet on wet technique as well as the salt effect. You can find this tutorial in real time by clicking the link in the description box. It is free. You will also find the sketch and the reference image on there as well, and the list of the materials that I use. The first thing I do when I start painting, especially if I use the wet on wet technique, is tape my page down with either washi tape or clear tape in this case, and that just helps it stay straight and not warp. And when your page warps, it also pulls the color in the dips of the paper, and that is not the effect that we want. I'm wetting the paper with a clean large brush and I'm doing it in sections. You need to make sure that your water is fairly consistent throughout the page so that you can get the desired effect where the colors blend into each other seamlessly. So the paper just needs to be glistening with water, but it's not too wet. It doesn't need to pool in the paper, otherwise you'll get pools of color. And if it starts to dry, then you're not going to get a smooth transition between the colors as well. So you just need to practice a little bit with it until you are comfortable with the consistency that you get. Then I'm dropping some clean water onto my page, and that creates a bleached effect in some of the areas where the water falls and pushes out the paint. Then I'm adding some salt. It doesn't need to be any special type, just whatever household salt you have at home. And you can experiment with different size salt. Basically, the salt will absorb the paint where it's still wet. So you need to make sure that your paint is still wet when you're applying salt to it. If it's too wet, it will absorb too much and the salt is not big enough. So you won't get the bleached effect. But if it's too dry, the salt has nothing to absorb. So you need to practice with that as well and just experiment a little bit. When the salt has done its job, you will see that it's doing a bleached effect as well, but it will look a little bit like snowflakes. Once you've finished with one section, you move on to the rest. And here I'm doing a fairly large section all at one time. And if you're going to do that, you need to make sure that you consistently wet the paper and you watch it to make sure that it hasn't started drying in any of the areas. If it has, you can add a little bit more water to that area, or you can work fairly quick and just keep reapplying the paint to the areas that are starting to dry. And when you're applying the paint, it will re-wet that area and keep it moist for the next paint application. I'm starting with the light blue color and adding a little bit of turquoise to it as well, just for a bit of an interest, and that creates a bit of a glow around the moon. It creates the lighter area in the center of the page so that we can add darker edges and bring the viewer's eye to the center of the page and to our focal point. After I added the lighter color, I am using the darker blue. And I'm just doing a mixture, so I'm doing some darker turquoise, some darker blue. I'm adding a bit of black or paynes gray to the blue just to intensify it a little bit, and I'm applying it horizontally. So I'm either drawing horizontal squiggly lines, or I'm just dipping the brush onto the page to add the spots of color, and that gives us a look of clouds on the page. Once I've done the center, I'm going around the edges with a really dark color. So that's mostly Paynes gray, and Paynes gray is a gray color with a bit of a blue to it. So I don't need to add too much, but you can also add a bit of blue to your gray, just depending on the type of a gray that you have. I will list the colors that I've used in the description box below so you can check them out, but you can use whatever paints you have. It is important to go around the edges with a dark color, and that just intensifies it. It gives the page a bit of a mood and also frames it and draws an eye to the center of the page. Don't forget that watercolor dries a lot lighter, so you might want to darken up those edges a bit more than you think you need to. But if you are not too adventurous and you want to just leave it as is because you don't want to ruin the page, but honestly, it will not be ruined, so be brave. But If you wanted to leave it as is, you can always go back with a second layer and add more color. I've added some more salt to the other edges as well. It is more prominent in the areas where the darker paint was applied, so you can see that effect a lot better. And I will also zoom in at some stage when I'm adding the detail. You will be able to see the snowflake-like effect from the salt a little bit closer. Once your background is dry, you need to make sure it is dry so that you don't want it to run into the moon and mix the colors. Then you can go over the moon with the same technique. So first we apply some clean water and making sure that we go around the edges carefully so that we are not going to run the color into the background. We want our edges to stay as neat as possible. That will also help us at the later stage of the painting and make the job a little bit easier. Then I am applying a light wash of the beige color that I have picked out for the moon. And once that color is down, I'm starting to add spots of color all around the moon, referencing the photo. So you have a photo reference, and that gives you a good idea of where the colors need to go, how dark they need to be, where the darks are, so the highlights and shadows. You will notice if you look closely that the bottom part of the moon around the edges is darker. It's in more of a shadow than the top of it. So we are going to add more darker color down the bottom, and then we are going to add highlights on top. Adding the shadows and highlights in the right places help us create a 3D look of your image. On this first application though, we are just trying to block in the colors and the shapes where they're going to be, and it's more of a background layer. So don't worry too much about the shapes and where they are, and even too much about the color, just making sure you don't do the highlighted areas too dark. We can rectify it later, but the more correctly you do your application of color now, the less work you will have to do later. We are still working in wet on wet technique, so you will notice that our colors are blending into each other and we're not getting harsh edges. As you're starting to add more and more detail to it, you need to work on the page when it's starting to dry so that you don't lose all of the detail and all of the markings that you are putting onto the page. If you are putting the markings on when the page is completely dry, you will get harsh edges. It may or may not be the look you're going for, but if you still want the edges to be smooth, you need to work on your page fairly quickly and when it's not too wet so that you're not losing all of that detail. Just keep going around the page, adding different color, and when you're happy with that layer, let it dry completely before we take the next step. Before I finish with this layer, I have realized that some of the areas have gone a little bit too dark for me. So those areas I have added some white watercolor paint and just gone over those areas to tone them down a little bit. So it gives it a bit of a whitewash, a bit of a cloudy look. Once the page is dry, I'm going to go over it with a next layer. For that layer, you wet the page again, so just be careful to go around the edges of the moon so that you're not re-wetting the background. And you need to go fairly light so that you don't scrub off any of your underneath layers of paint. Because we are working with watercolor, water will activate the paint, even the paint that's already dry that's on your page. So you don't want to scrub it too much, otherwise you will disturb whatever work you've already done. But if you go over it fairly lightly and just re-wet the surface, then you can reapply the paint over the top of it like a glaze and add some more work. At this stage, we are going to color correct some of the gray. I've realized that my gray is a bit too blue gray. That was Payne's gray because it does have some blue color in it. And I wanted it to be a bit more brown beige. So I glazed over it with my beige paint. I've gone over the whole page and then I started concentrating on the areas that I wanted to be darker. So I've gone over the bottom of the moon, the bottom edge, and I've added it a bit more color. I've added a bit more brown to it, a bit more beige brown, and that just gave it a bit more weight. The top of it is going to be lighter, so that will create our 3D shape that we are looking for. Reference your image and study it carefully to see where the markings are, what shape they are, what direction they're going in, how dark or light they are, and that will help make the shape look more 3D and make it look like a heavier object and make it look more realistic. Keep working, adding more and more layers. If you feel like you've gone a little bit too dark, you can use a tissue paper or a paper towel to lift some paint so you don't scrub it. You just dab it lightly with the towel and it will lift up whatever paint you've applied. Once it dries again completely, you can do the next step, which is the gouache and a very thin paintbrush. You're going to create some stronger highlights with gouache, and we're using gouache because it is more opaque than watercolor. However, it does behave in a very similar way. So gouache is kind of like an opaque version of watercolor. It is activated with water, and you can dilute it with water, creating a more transparent effect. So I'm going to do both things. I'm going to apply it fairly thick and opaque around the edges, and then some areas I'm going to spread out onto the page, creating the highlights on the actual moon. And when it's a bit more diluted, it will go on a lot brighter, as you can see here. However, it will dry a lot lighter and a lot duller. So you need to keep that in mind. If you've gone too dull or too light in an area, you can go over it again with another mix of your gouache. Or if you think you have gone too dark, you can in turn add some water to it with a paintbrush and just carefully lighten it up. Adding highlights creates more 3D shape, and it just helps tidy up the edges as well. You will notice that I've added a fair bit of highlight to the top of the moon, but not so much to the bottom. If you refer to your image, the bottom does not have too much highlight at the actual edge, but the top does. So you need to keep that in mind and follow those markings carefully, because that is what gives us our 3D shape. Our moon is now looking a lot more 3D. You can see how it's now got more highlighted areas and more darks, and the markings look a lot more in the places where they should be. So now our moon is almost finished. The next step is going to be adding some splatters onto the background to create the look of stars. To do that, we are going to grab a large brush and dilute our gouache paint a little bit more, because it makes it easier to do the splatters. So you grab the brush and you dip it in the paint, and then you tap it to create the splatters onto our background. If you get splatters on the moon, which you will, you just need to either clean them up with a towel or to sort of scrape it or extend it with a paintbrush. To create a fine mist of stars, you are going to need either a toothbrush or a brush with strong bristles, and then you do the same thing. You dip it in the paint, make sure that it's all covered in paint and it's soaked in nicely, and then you just scrape over it with your finger. If you want more stars, go over it again, or if you're happy with your first application of stars, that's fine too. In this case, I've done it first, and then I have done my silhouette in black, and then I decided that I wanted a lot more stars, because you can never go with too many stars on the page, right? So I have gone with it a second time, and that ended up having white splatters over my black silhouette, which I had to clean up. If you don't want to clean up, then do it all before you do the black silhouette. But for the silhouette of the tree and the cat and the little birds that fly off the tree, you just need some black paint, and the thicker you do the application, the less layers you need to do, and it's also affected by the quality of your paint as well. But if you want to dilute your paint a bit more so that it's easier to go on the page, you just need to do a couple of applications, or 3 or 4, just depending on your page. In my case, I have done 2 layers and it's pretty black, so I was happy with it and I didn't need to do any more. That finishes up our page. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned something and you will give it a go. As I mentioned at the beginning, there is a full tutorial available for free, and the link to it is in the description box. That will give you access to a reference image as well as the sketch. So do give it a go and let me know how you went. If you want to see more tutorials and more videos, let me know what you would like to see. Give me a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos. I will see you next time. Bye.